Welcome, everybody. I'm Tammy Key-Kafer. I'm a licensed clinical social worker.
And my name is Desiree Grimaldi. Welcome to Unguarded Minds podcast, where we talk about all the nitty gritty drama and trauma things that life throws at you. Today we have a special guest, Jenn Fisher. She is a travel blogger, teacher, trauma survivor, author, and determined overcomer. Her travel blog helps trauma survivors self-healing through solo travel and nature mindfulness. Topics include abandonment, grief, generational trauma, and ancestral healing arts. So welcome, Jenn. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you, Desiree. Thank you, Tammy.
Yeah, thanks. Go ahead, Desiree. Did you want to kick us off?
I know you guys had a moment to speak right before. So I would just love to dive in. And I know that one of the topics you wanted to talk about was once divorced, twice married. How that came to and the things that you learned along the way.
I have even a bigger smile on my face because my son was at the thrift store and he almost bought me a shirt that said, "So nice, I married him twice." So, yeah, I gotta be honest, I had no clue how that would impact people in my personal life and in my work settings, in the broader public. I had no idea that remarrying my ex-husband. At first, I thought that it was okay. Well, people were being nice, and bear with me because I have a point. People were being nice or being supportive, but then, you know, um, it really opened my eyes how people um, in society do care about happy endings in healthy ways. Happy endings in healthy ways. So to think that family is a dying breed is not my experience. I just had no idea that people cared about people being reunited in love, in peace, and the point is that it it restored my faith in kindness and society at large. I just was blown away by people's reactions, and I think that being a trauma survivor, I became very cynical over the years and was like, who cares? You don't need love to be happy because you don't. Like, not romantic love, of course. And there's still a part of me that doesn't want to hook into a fairy tale ending. So I had to sit with that for a while and understand what I was feeling like, because this is my life and this is my family that I love dearly. And as you know from my story, or you'll hear that I had to choose me or my family at one point. I could not go on anymore after probably at least 10 years of trying um, in a marriage that was very loving and very codependent. We married young and became parents young. And throughout the marriage, there was nothing but respect. And we tried really hard. Like if you could have a marriage of two people that tried, we would be like marriage of the year. But we were so silently isolated because there was really, and no intimacy like that we both wanted and deserved, but couldn't get there, not together. So at one point, having to choose myself over the marriage and hating myself for choosing myself, I had to reconcile that part of me that was like, I'm confused now. Like, I'm not sure. Like, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that I was supposed to do that all along? I mean, I know that's not the answer, not at all. But I also needed to sit with that part that was very willing to go ahead and live a single life,
Hey, Jenn.
So what ended up happening was that for the first probably 3 to 4 years after leaving the marriage, I really hated myself. I really hated myself for choosing myself. I blamed myself for ruining my children's lives. I had two children at home at the time when I left. They were like 9 years old and 10 years old. And then my oldest daughter was away, and she was at school, and she was around 19. So the guilt, the guilt was relentless. I didn't think I deserved to grieve. And I don't say that because I want anybody to feel sorry for me. Believe me, like, I wanted the punishment to fit the crime because I believe that I ruined their lives. So that has been healed. But the thing is reconciling everybody's reaction to, I'm marrying my ex-husband and we're back together. Reconciling where I was in my single life before then, a woman who was independent and healthy. And, do I want romantic love? Yeah. Do I need it? No, I don't need it, but I still wanted it. And, that was how it did lead to us getting back together and getting remarried. But I didn't want to abandon that part of me that was okay being alone, if that, makes sense. I didn't want to throw that part of me under the bus. Like, look, everything's okay now because we're remarried, and everybody approves. Like, so it took a little while, and I don't really have any black and white conclusions. The takeaway of people's reaction that families are reunited was heartwarming to them and meaningful to them, touched me, touched my heart. And I was really grateful that I brought a smile, that our story, did that. If you had told me that would be people's reaction, I would not have believed you. Be like, get the fuck out of here. People don't care, They don't care.
Trauma, though, was that with your husband, or was that like childhood trauma, or like that you brought
No.
into the marriage?
Well, hey, Jen, it says that your recording stopped. I think you have to refresh.
Okay, how about now? Is it recording now?
Yeah.
Okay, a call came through. It bumped me out for a minute.
That's okay.
Okay. Do you want to ask the question again, maybe?
Yeah. So you talk a lot about trauma. Is that like trauma within your marriage or trauma prior to your marriage that was kind of brought over?
So the trauma was absolutely a carry-in from childhood. I did not have trauma with my marriage. And the irony is that it was so quiet and safe. I thought that was the problem. So childhood trauma, abandonment, incest survivor, neglect, domestic abuse, alcoholic uh, upbringing, the family disease of alcoholism generationally. So, I tried to heal the trauma. I did different modalities throughout my early 20s and 30s. It just didn't go deep enough. I still was frozen inside. As an incest survivor, it makes total sense now, Uh, so if you have any incest survivors listening, my heart goes out to you because that's about the most broken way, the number one way to break a person's soul, So I had tried to heal that in the marriage, but I couldn't. I felt as though he and I were both trying to connect to each other, but the real work needed to be done on our own, both of us. And somewhere deep down, we both knew it. We both knew we were addicted to not abandoning each other. So it was like I was so addicted to not wanting him to feel like I didn't love him, and then that I would abandon myself. And that came very easily to me. I got very good at that. So he didn't really know who I was, and I didn't really know who he was. And that went on for years, you know. So our family was um, very much centered on our children, and we were really good parents. You know, we were really good parents, and we were really good friends. But I would say, based on my buried PTSD from incest, no one was going to get near me on any significant level until that was, and I resented that. I resented having an intimate partner that, you know, was very, very clearly, there was elephant in the room for 10 years.
So you said that you had married pretty young. Was he that person that sort of got you out of your family system because it was just so toxic, and he came along and it was like, yes.
That's my mom's story. And you know, my perpetrator for the incest was my father, and he was 20 years older than her. So, without a doubt, he was a stalker. And she was like jumping from the frying pan into the fire, getting away from her family of origin. Um, but no, not at all. I was in college, and we met. Well, we went to the same high school, so we knew each other, but we met when we were in college again. And honestly, it was a pretty normal, um, nothing out of the ordinary meeting. It was like a healthy, we met, we fell in love.
Had you done any work prior to? I mean, it probably wasn't encouraged to go get help, therapy, or talk to anyone in your family. So, had you tried to do any work with that?
At that time, I was about 20. And quite honestly, my work was I am going to college, I'm going to get a career, and like, fuck yous all. Like, I'm not going to make the same mistakes that you guys did. So, I was an alcoholic in the making. I got sober when I was 28 from alcoholism. But it was a good 8 years of active alcoholism. So no, I wasn't doing therapy. I was trying to like self-will it around, you know, achieving. I thought I could break the cycle that way. I know I'm not the first one that came along with that genius plan, to go ahead and show them. But that was where I was at that point. Yeah.
How long were you separated before you and your husband ended up back together?
8 years. Divorced for probably about 4. Because we didn't get divorced right away because we were very good friends, and I trusted him. At first, when a marriage first breaks up, there's not any trust. There's just pain and more pain. But it didn't take too long, because I think after 20, we were about 20 years at that point, um, of a foundation of trust, and respect. So after the first 3 or 4 years, or actually maybe 2 years, we were able to start again and focus on our kids very clearly. But even so, we didn't get divorced because financially it was better for him for us to wait. And so he made that request, and I was happy to honor it because I was the one that said, I'm leaving, and I broke his heart. And I love this person very much. I didn't want to hurt him, but my decision hurt him. So we waited, and then we finally did get divorced. And then, we went another like 4 years divorced. And then, yeah.
And so that first 4 years, were you living separately, or were you trying to live together but not be together?
No, it was sure and swift. I was out of there.
You were out. Okay.
Yeah, we had a family home, and about a month after I told him that I needed to go, I moved. I rented a townhome in the same neighborhood where we live, and um, and then I lived alone the whole time. Now, for me, that was the first time I'd ever lived alone. So a lot of eye-opening moments. About 2 years after I left the family home, I bought my own house, and then I lived very independently on 2.5 acres, um, about 6 miles from the family home. And that's when I felt like a pioneer woman at that point. That's when I really learned independence, and that's where I did the bulk of my healing. Because after 2 years, it was only scratching the surface of the buried trauma. Once I was really, really alone, because, in the townhome, my kids were coming and going. Now they were a little bit older, and I was a little more established in my healing. And, the more time I spent alone, the deeper I went. And so I bought that house, and I lived there for about 7 years. And at that point, it was when the real layers started to peel back.
So what did that process look like for you? Where'd you start? I know you do a lot in nature, and can you tell us what that healing process looked like?
Yeah, absolutely. Looking back, can see that it started, if I describe it linearly, in a linear fashion, I started with solo hiking. And as I spent time alone in the woods, in the forest, hiking trails, that's when I could start to slowly release, slowly start to hear my own voice, live my own life, breaking free from a lot of the codependency. I had spent so much time taking care of everybody else my entire life. Like since I was a young child, I was taking care of my parents, their emotional needs, their, other needs. And so, you know, in that time, I like probably anybody, built up a lot of resentment over making my life about everybody else, a lot of anger. Um, so I had to start there. I used a lot of different therapies. I did art therapy. I didn't have an art therapist per se. I did have a traditional therapist that I came across through a codependent, um, crossroads. So after I left the marriage, I decided to get into a different romantic relationship. And that's really when, the trauma shit hit the fan. Because that person was, you know, um, that relationship brought out my buried anger, you know. So now what I was dealing with was what seemed to be about the relationship, but it wasn't. It was the abandonment from childhood. It was also a lot of the incest that had, nowhere to go. So I got a canvas and some paints, and I just let myself go. And, some of the art that I had created was pretty shocking. It was very, like one picture, there was a um, blood dripping from the eyes, and I just sat back and couldn't really believe what appeared before my eyes. So I was able to see, how all of that trauma was sitting around my head, sitting around my heart. And, a lot of that was abandoned because I didn't have the tools to process it during the time I was being abused. But it never, I left it, which means like I abandoned myself, my teenage self at that age that I was. But it never left me, and it was still in my life, that showed me that it needed to have my attention. Also, I began to do work around my house. I love the freedom of just creating and building, and I loved my garage. I love to go in my garage. Like it was like a man cave for me, and I was very empowered by just swinging a hammer and being independent. And then I did a lot of yard work, which was very physical, and that was very healing through creating in my yard. Not just some of it was the grunge work. I love to put on the boots and get all sweaty. I really did. That was very healing for me. For people who aren't necessarily being helped by traditional therapy, I was helped by traditional therapy, but I also was taught by my therapist early on that healing was my responsibility. I had to assume that responsibility. I had to step into the personal responsibility role of healing myself. So I'd never set out to do gardening or hiking or art and say, this is how I'm going to heal myself today. It wasn't structured. It wasn't rigid. I just had all of this time with myself. I pulled myself out of that life where I had to be for everybody else, I thought. As a trauma survivor, that was all I knew. And now I'm in completely different setting. So in that way, it was the perfect setting. I sometimes I think about it and I want to tell people, okay, so just do this. Like most people can't change their life like that. You can't just like walk out of your life and go live alone. I get that, but that's my story. And by doing that, it changed my entire being. I don't think I could have done that with anybody else in any other setting. I had to be alone.
And I think you're right. Like, you work with what you got. So if you can't up and move onto 2.5 acres in the forest, then you still have to use what you got, because it sounds like you just listen to yourself. If I want to paint, I'm going to paint. If I want to, swing a hammer, I'm going to swing a hammer. If I want to hike, I'm going to hike. And I think that's the key. What were your kids' reactions? Like, did they see this transformation happen in you?
Well, there was a lot of other mini explosions after that. I was doing my best desperately to be there for my kids. I was very frantic around their mental health and their well-being. And so my children were 20 months apart, 1 year apart in school. My older son, he started to show signs of depression, very lethargic, almost like I thought he had mono because he would just fall asleep. But it was, his affect was so flat. Um, I don't know, when I found out that it was more emotional than physical, because I took him to the doctor. And, it was like, I feel like the blood drained out of my face when I was in the doctor's office. And she said, well, how is he emotionally? Because I knew what she was asking me. I knew what she was saying. And I was, very shocked that I didn't see that. I had no idea that he was suffering. Um, so after that, I literally begged him to go to therapy. I was desperate. I was losing my son. He was at a very um, um, drastic age. He was like 10, well, no, he was about 12. That is a hard age for kids. So he went to therapy and it worked out. It was short and sweet and it worked out. My younger son was much more complicated, and that ended up being a probably 2-year trial of mental health interventions. Um, but he came out trans around that time and was also diagnosed major depressive disorder and suicidal. So my kids were my entire focus for a while. Um, at first, we responded by I don't think it hit them yet, but again, like that is a very hard age to go through that. I personally think like it is hard to go through divorce at any but somewhere I thought, well, they're older now, they're more established in their own lives. It'll be easier for them. Um, you know, and they came out the other side, both of them, definitely 100%, because they're much older now, and established in their lives. And yet, that was a time to come together as a family for my youngest son. I kind of insisted on family therapy, and because my husband, my at the time was ex, we were still co-parenting and doing our best to make it right for our kids. So we did a lot of interventions, and we did do family therapy. And, I know my kids are better for what they went through, for 100%. Staying in a marriage, where your parents are pretending to love each other with all of this repressed stuff, that's just going to repeat the cycle, I believe. If that's what you have to do, there's no judgment. Because guess what? The other option is just as miserable, you know? So nobody can say what's right for somebody else.
Well, if you stayed in it, you might not even have you might not have noticed what your son was going through if you stayed in it, because you'd be so focused on working on your marriage and trying to keep that going. So, I'm sure that helped you be able to identify what was going on a little bit deeper with your kids, which was able to benefit them.
I agree with you. I also think that I would have, even if I wasn't focused on trying to save the marriage, I didn't have the tools to give anything to them. I didn't have the tools to give it to myself. So I probably would have had a, trauma response, which would have been dissociating in some way or another. I would not have been able to face it head on because I didn't have the tools to do that.
Yeah. And that's what you mean by repeating the cycle, that, just the checking out, this is, I don't know what to do, freezing. Yeah. That trauma response.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, so you had said like if we had any listeners that have been through similar abuse as you, that your heart goes out to them. If it's okay with you, I have a couple questions. I always have questions. One, did you make your mother aware, like when that was taking place? Like, how old were you when you finally felt like you were able to tell somebody? Do you wish you would have said something sooner? Any advice? I'm just thinking, like, if we have people who are listening who are potentially going through it or have went through it recently, like, what did that look like for you to even tell anybody that happened?
More trauma. I did share with my mother one part of the abuse. My dad was a voyeur, so there were holes around the house where I could be seen undressing or, not without my consent. So that was the part of the abuse that I shared with her because I had the evidence. I said, look, there's, this is where he's watching me. and she completely dissociated. She was zombied, you know. Um, but I had an older sister who was 3 years older than me. I told her first, and she was repulsed and shocked. So she said, "Well, we got to tell mom." And I was like, "Okay." So my sister and I, my sister was by my side. I was around maybe 13, right around there. The abuse started well, probably when I was born, honestly, because he was a pedophile, um, and not in any kind of awareness of that. So it started way before I was born and continued until he died. So I know that like the victims were there for years, and it was not, just me. Anyway, so it probably started, once I hit puberty, and then continued until probably when I moved out at 17. But my sister stood by my side, and we went to my mom and we showed her, and she just literally numbed out and then walked away, saying nothing. Um, and then that was it. It was like, okay, you know, I didn't
So
have
nothing
any.
changed after you had said something. You were just still sitting in that position and now feeling like, okay, nobody cares and we're all just going to act like this is normal and keep going with our everyday lives. It must have been
Right.
hard as a kid to process that.
Oh, absolutely. I think again, it breaks your spirit. Why would you try to fight the system? You're just going to lose. It does carry on. The effects are very far reaching. And the saddest effect I think of all is to give up on myself. As a trauma survivor, I understand the pain and the like intense work that it takes to try one more time, to try again, because you have been beaten down by the trauma, and then the trauma lives in your head and tells you, to not try again. There were other forms of abuse, but that I didn't disclose. Just inappropriate touching and groping and other things that were a betrayal to my physical, emotional, and psychological well-being.
And when your mom just shut down, I'm imagining maybe she had her own trauma also. But did you, at that point, was it like, do we tell somebody else, or what's the point? Like maybe just if my mom's not going to listen to me, maybe nobody is. Like you said, you can't beat the system. What what was that? Is that kind of what was that like?
Well, what I've learned from doing the work is that, I do a lot of inner child work and inner teenager work. And I can tell you that when I spent that time alone, connected exactly back to that abuse preteen, I was still pissed off and enraged, and still there. So what I felt at the time was probably nothing, because I didn't have the tools to feel anything. I didn't, that's what the PTSD was. It was just like, okay, lock in my body and stay there until, maybe never. Thank God it wasn't maybe never, it was resolved now in my 40s, Um, so, you know, um, I see now that I'm on the other side of it, I do see kids that are walking around traumatized. They're children, so they just do what's in front of them. I did what was in front of me. I played sports. I had my friends, and I was hell bent on getting the hell away from there, as fast as I could. So I controlled what I could, which was, I would try to be at my friend's house as much as possible. My sister was there for me. She was older than me. So once she started driving, she would take me with her, to get me out of the house. But she couldn't take me everywhere. And that's when the abuse would happen. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's the most tender and gentle part of healing, is to understand that you were alone when it happened. him, or else you wouldn't probably be a trauma survivor. Like, if you could have, I think if I could have dealt with it, I would have been brought to therapy. I would have had somebody, professional to process it. So there was no processing. There was nothing. There was just, okay, more of the same.
And so at what point did you disclose all this to your husband? Did he know what you had dealt with growing up, or did this all come out after you did your own healing?
He did know my history, and so that was complicated because the type of person that he is and that he was, he didn't have the tools to help me. He didn't know what to say. He's a very like soft-spoken man. So it was too much for him. He's not he didn't have that fight in him, I he and I definitely believe that his family was well, we find each other. So his family had a lot of the same issues, whether his mom was incested or his grandfather committed suicide. But they didn't talk about stuff during those generations. Nothing. He was raised in a very religious household with a lot of conventional supports in place. He had shelter. He had a parent. He had two parents. He had the finances to, be able to have a normal childhood, but emotionally, he was as or almost as bankrupt as I was in the emotional needs. His mom was a caregiver, but they're not going to touch those topics. So that's what he learned. So, what I internalized, he never told me this, but what I internalized was that I internalized the stigma, you know. So if there are trauma survivors listening and you want to share with somebody that can't handle it, find somebody else. Because the takeaway when people that you love can't handle it is that something's wrong with you. And that is the worst thing that you can do to your soul. Find somebody who's strong enough who can, hold that space for you and say, "This is not your fault." Like that's their fault, that's their sickness. Like if somebody looks at you blankly, like my mother did and my husband tried. He tried, but he wasn't able to show up for me in that way. He didn't have the tools, and that's what I wanted in a partner, somebody who could meet me where I was, and so, yeah, I can't emphasize it enough to find somebody that's strong enough to hold that space for you. Because you're already feeling enough toxic shame. You don't need somebody else adding to it. Because the hypervigilance of sharing with somebody. Obviously, I learned how to read people and watch their reaction. And most people do not want to talk about incest. So along the way, I was blessed to have the courage to find survivors of incest anonymous and a recovery partner who got me and I got her, and to this day we still support each other's recovery. So that's a big breaking of the chain of the abuse.
So did your
A lot of
husband also?
courage.
Sure does. Sorry, Desiree. Yeah. Did your husband do his own inner work while you guys were separated?
That's a good question. He had spent years in Al-Anon. When we first got married, I was an active alcoholic for at least the first 6 to 7 years. And it definitely impacted him. So he was in the Al-Anon program to help, his being in a relationship with a person with alcoholism or loving somebody with alcoholism. And he carried those tools with him throughout, you know. Yeah. I don't think he went for therapy. I'm not sure about that. I never thought about it. Um, but he used those tools and still does.
Well, maybe when you got into family therapy with your kids, that was, probably, um, I'm sure we got a lot out of that. And Al Anon is so much about boundaries and codependency and all that too. So, yeah, yeah.
For sure.
So, how long have you been back together?
We got remarried in January of 2024, a day apart from our original wedding anniversary. I wanted to get remarried on our anniversary, but that was going to be a Saturday, and the justice of the peace wasn't available on Saturday. So 7 months,
Mm-hmm.
7 months, yeah, yeah. We got married. We had gotten back together about 6 months before then, which was a fun story too.
How'd you get back together?
So during the time that my kids were growing up and my youngest son had serious problems around mental health and his gender, he decided to move out of shared custody with me and live just with his father. And during that time, um, he was being raised mostly by him. And as the years went on and my kids were getting older, it was time to look for colleges. So my youngest son wanted to go to Boston, go to college in Boston. My older son was in Hoboken. So when it came time to go looking at colleges, I was surprised when my ex-husband suggested we shared a hotel room with the three of us, not just him and I. Um, and I know that he didn't have any ulterior motives. I think he just wanted to save money because he was concerned about having two kids in college. So, at that time though, I had a secret, and my secret was that I wanted to know if he thought there was a chance for us to get back together. Um, I had spent a lot of time soul searching during the years apart, and I had dated. I had a longer term relationship, but I also dated, and I was ready. I was like, all of my leaves were um, unturned, and I needed to know where I stood with him because I realized what we had was very precious, one in a million, you know. But I had to learn that my way, through different relationships and different experiences. And so I knew that, and I knew I was still interested in him as a partner. And we were in the hotel in Boston, and my son was in the other room. I thought he couldn't hear us, but apparently he could. When I asked my ex-husband, I'm like, "So do you think there's a chance for us?" And he was like, "What?" And I was like, "Well, at one point, I brought it back to him. I was like, when we first separated, you came to me and you said, 'Do you think there's still a chance?' And I said, 'No, I definitely was not, going back. I knew I had something to do with my life, and it was not getting back together.' But all the years we were apart, I thought about how he had the courage to come to me and ask me that question. Um, and the answer was no. And then he knew where he stood with me and where, the relationship was. And we spent the next many years saying goodbye, and not investing in anything in that, But in the hotel room, I asked him if he remembered that. I said, "Do you remember when you asked me that question?" And he was like, "No." I said, "Well, you did. You asked me if I thought there was a chance that we could get back together." He's like, "Okay." And I said, "Well, I'm asking you that now." He's like, blank stare, no words. And he's like, "What?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm asking you if there's a chance that we could get back together. Do you think there's a chance for us?" He was like, uh, "I wasn't expecting you to say that." I was like, "It's okay. I understand. I caught you off guard." I said, "But, I used to think I wasn't worthy of your love. And I know that's not true. Um, I didn't know a lot about life, and I thought that there was a lot about me that was unlovable, and I know that that's not true. It's you, it's always been you. I want to know if you're interested in ever getting back together with me. And he was like, can I think about it? Just take your time. He's like, I'm not going anywhere. So, he didn't sleep that night, he told me. And then we did the college tours in Boston. And, the next day I was carefully reading his body language. And I was like, I think it's a yes. I'm not sure, but I think it's a yes. We went and got coffee at the hotel lobby. And I don't know. We mixed up the cups. I take a lot of sugar in my coffee. So it was like, well, which one is which? And when he tasted both cups, I was like, he's in. He's in because he drank from my cup. It's like when you're like a little kid and they're like, oh, you drank from his cup, that means you kissed. So that's that's how I process things in life. But he didn't say it then. We went through our tour and went back to New Jersey, and then the next day he called, and I didn't know. I didn't know if he was going to think about it for a year, but the next day he called. He's like, I'm in. Yes, I'm saying yes. So I was like, oh, okay, cool. Now what do we do? Like, now what do we do? It was very surreal. It was very surreal. But yeah, then I sold my house and moved back home.
Wow, what a journey.
Mm.
Well, I've
Speaking
read
of journeys, I just pulled up your book, Roots and Wings, Finding Freedom Through Nature and Travel. Do you cover kind of all of this plus your healing journey in your book?
I do. I purposely wrote the book because I felt as though it was piecemeal on my blog. You can do this, you can do that. Like, yeah, this is for control and fear. This is for grief. This is my first trip. It was very piecemeal. And I felt if people, I don't know, I thought it would make more sense to put it like in a organized story that you could see from the beginning to the middle of the end. That's how I like to watch people. I really enjoy learning from people. So I need to make sure, I'm following a lot of the steps that they took. So I thought that it made more sense to put it all together. And I do go into more detail in the book along some of the abuse, that people, might not want to just walk into. I don't want to trigger anybody, and I do put trigger warnings in the book for people who don't want to stumble upon that unprepared. But yeah.
Is that book on Amazon?
Is that what? I'm sorry.
Is
On
your book
Amazon?
on Amazon?
It's not. It is on my website. It's for sale on my website
We
in
have
the
the
ebook
link.
format.
We'll link it
good.
below in the description.
Oh, good.
Thank you.
Well, your journey is really phenomenal, and just the fact that I think one of my favorite parts is that you went outside of traditional therapy and just listened to your body. I just think that your body's always talking to you, and you paid attention. And going what you went through, you were the only one that had to pay attention, and you took the time and space to do that. And I just think it is like Desiree says, it's just very courageous. And it takes a lot of insight and time and patience and forgiveness of yourself, all of it. Yeah.
Be a lot of grieving for sure. Yeah. And so people listening can know that it can be done. Because I walked out of the marriage, house, car, education, master's degree, Sunday school teacher, everything was pretty suburban and normal, very normal, and my life swung in a completely different direction. And I had to rip that all apart. Everything, everything. Like, we were in a community, and people were our friends and family, neighbors, acquaintances were shocked, and because I left, I felt much shame So then, then there was other parts of my story that the trauma came out in more destructive ways. So, no matter where you're coming from, we're all just kind of like on the continuum. It doesn't matter where you enter, it doesn't matter where you end, because until you die, you're not going to end anyway. I'm not going to be perfect. I'll never be perfect, but I do know how to heal my trauma and not have to suffer triggers from that time healing myself. Yeah.
Such good information. I read your blogs. I really enjoy them.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for being on here with us today, and we wish you the very best and appreciate your time today and just your words of wisdom and encouragement for our listeners.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation. Oh, thank you. And I'll be posting this too as well.
Great. Thanks. All right.